Is January 23rd Community Service and Public Safety Committee meeting, and thank you all for joining us this morning. Zendaya, are we in compliance with FOIA? Yes, ma'am. Great. And I'd like to take the opportunity to say the Pledge of Allegiance, if you'll join me, please. I pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America, to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all. Thank you. All right. And Zendaya, would you like to call the roll, please?
Mr. Alfred?
Here.
Mr. Brown?
Here.
Here. Here. And we have approval of the minutes. There was a regular meeting on October 24th, 2022. Is there a motion to approve the regular meeting minutes of that date?
Neither Mr. Alfred nor I were a member of the committee. I won't oppose them. I have read them.
Alex, were you on that?
I was not on the committee either.
Weren't either. So when reviewing this with Krista, she said to move through it so that we've made an attempt. Mac, do you have thoughts on how we address this? I'm sorry. The only person who was on this committee during the time period of the minutes that we're trying to approve was myself.
Unless there's any reason why, you think that they would be inaccurate, I think it would be appropriate.
Okay. Then I will approve them. Okay.
There's still need a motion.
Okay.
I'm an alternate to this committee, and I was present at that time. Does that make any difference? No, it was not a member.
Not a voting member now.
Without objection, the minutes can stand approved.
Okay. Are there any objections?
No objection.
Okay. All right. Okay. Are there any appearances by citizens who wish to address this committee? Right. Cindy, has anyone signed up, or were there any comments through the portal? Anything along? Nope. Okay. Then we can go on to new business. We have a consideration of proposed Community Service and Public Safety Committee meeting dates for the calendar year 2023. Is there a motion to approve the meeting dates?
So moved. I'll second.
Madam Chair, if
Discussion?
I could speak to the motion. I have a standing commitment at 9:30 in the mornings to a conditioning class. And if this meeting and public planning also meets at 10 o'clock, it means for this week, I'm out 2 classes a week, and I have a personal commitment to wellness. So I respectfully request if we could consider an afternoon time. I could come at 11, but I'll come in my gym clothes. And as I indicated, I'll be happy to sit all the way down on the end and away from you. But if we could consider meeting in the afternoon instead of in the morning, I would appreciate it.
Any discussion?
It won't make any difference to me. I'm happy to make a change.
My only comment is 10 o'clock has worked well. The morning hours has worked well in the past for me. And I understand that we all have our own personal commitments, but I would also like to know how this might impact staff and their ability to meet this assignment. Any comments from?
Madam Chairwoman, staff will be prepared whatever time council and the committee wants to meet. We just need to know the schedule in advance so that we can prepare accordingly. But it's really up to the committee as to when they want to choose to meet, and we will adjust accordingly.
Okay. Is there a suggested time?
2 o'clock on Monday?
So Monday.
I assume there are no other committees that are scheduled for Monday. or Monday afternoon in particular?
If there are, the way that we typically do kind of a hierarchy of preferences, town council is going to take precedence over everything else. A standing committee of council comes next. Then it comes to our boards, agencies, and commissions. And so we kind of work in that order. If there does happen to be a conflict, then we'll work with them to readjust that schedule depending upon that hierarchy.
Any additional questions? I'm sorry, Chet.
The Board of Zoning Appeals meets the fourth Monday.
Oh, those people.
Right. Right, so that is a consideration.
Yeah. I mean, another option would be to make the two committee meetings, different weeks. Or we could try Wednesday, but Planning Commission meets, see, they now meet on a Wednesday afternoon, not in the morning, I believe is right. I'm looking at Mr. Alfred, who served on the Planning Commission, to remember their schedule.
So I'm just going to jump in and continue with my comment that this timeframe has, 10 a.m. has worked well over the past, and I'm comfortable with it in terms of my obligations to town council, which comes first, and to this committee. So I'm in favor of retaining the 10 a.m. timeframe. If there's no objection, I'd like to move the motion and approve the dates continuing at 10 a.m. Timeframe. So, Zendaya, you can call the roll.
Has there been a second?
Yes, there was, right? Mm-hmm. Yeah, Stephen and Alex, right, yeah.
Mr. Alfred?
Yes.
Mr. Brown?
Support.
No.
Ms. Becker?
Yes. All right. Discussion of personnel matters. Zendaya, I understand we need to enter into an executive session. Is that correct? Okay. Is there a motion to enter into executive session?
Madam Chair, I'm sorry to interrupt. Just out of curiosity, I know we have the staff attorney here, Mr. Mack. If I could ask a question about the process. I would like to see us try to be as open and transparent as possible. And is it possible to at least say that we have a certain number of vacancies on certain boards and commissions? And the discussion executive session, if I understand it, is about particular people to appoint to a board or commission. So we could at least tell the public how many vacancies we might be considering and for what board or commission. So would that be permissible? If it's permissible legally, then I would like to ask the chair and the committee if we could at least say that part so folks know.
I believe it's in our agenda. The Planning Commission has 3 openings that we are trying to fill. 1 seat is for an attorney, and 2 are at-large seats. Accommodation Tax Advisory Committee, there is 1 lodging seat that is currently ending June 30th, 2023. And the Board of Zoning Appeals, there's a 1 seat, attorney seat that, and a 1 at-large seat. There are a number of applications that have been submitted through the town portal. We call that the talent pool, and we will be discussing those applicants and their relative experience in education as it fits to the requirements of each one of these committees.
Great,
So
thanks.
and always you can find these types of things on the website as part of our agenda. All right, so was there a motion to go into executive committee
So
for the
moved.
reasons?
Second.
Okay. And do we need to call the roll? Zendaya, will you call the roll, please?
Mr. Alfred?
Yes.
Mr. Brown?
Support.
Ms. Bryson?
Yes.
Ms. Becker?
Yes. Thank you.
Yeah.
Fort Fremont closes out a 350-year legacy of coastal fortifications in Port Royal Sound, beginning in the mid-16th century. It also represents the closing chapter of America's coastal defense system before the dawn of air power. Fort Fremont is an example of the most advanced military technology of its time. It would parallel the B-17 and aircraft carrier of World War II, the F-35 of today. Fort Fremont was an important part of the Beaufort culture, very similar to Parris Island and the Marine Corps Air Base today.
In 1525, the Spaniards named this sound and this harbor Santa Elena. They called the navigational point La Punta de Santa Elena, the point of Santa Elena. And what the Spanish explorers discovered is that Port Royal Sound is a unique piece of geography. It's the deepest natural harbor south of the Chesapeake Bay, possibly south of New York. The channel into Port Royal Sound, this I find a remarkable geological fact. The channel has not changed for 500 years. There's no inlet on the southern coast that hasn't shifted entirely in 500 years, except Port Royal Sound. There's something geologically different, or one might say magical, about Port Royal Sound. So Spanish sailors, being the best in the world in their time, found this place very early, knew that for the Spanish explorations of the American Southeast, this would be the entrada, the entrance. And so they built a city across the river, across the sound from where we are on Parris Island. It became the first capital of Florida. And they explored the backcountry from this location for more than a century with the object of building a highway from this magnificent harbor to Mexico City. So the Sound was known to the Spaniards. It was known to the French, who actually got here first and created the first Protestant colony in the New World on Parris Island over my shoulder. And that colony was a failure. The Spaniards replaced them. It was part of Spanish Florida when the English arrived 150 years later. And this became, as a consequence, a battleground in the 18th century between Spanish interests in Florida and St. Augustine and the English colony in Carolina and in Charleston. And back and forth these wars went, many of them naval wars, many of them employing, as all the sailors knew by then, the magic of Port Royal Sound. When the Civil War came, Confederates defended the harbor, but it was basically indefensible against large naval forces. So the U.S. Navy made it their principal target during the beginning of the Civil War and sent the largest flotilla of ships assembled by the United States Navy in the 19th century into Port Royal Sound on November 7th, 1861. In a 4-hour cannonade, which would have been deafening from where we're sitting, was heard for miles from Savannah nearly to Charleston. It was called the Day of the Big Gun Shoot. During the Civil War, this harbor that we're looking at was filled with ships. There would be hundreds of ships in this harbor. There was a 1,000-foot dock with a railroad on top off of Hilton Head. The military installation was mammoth. There were 13,000 U.S. soldiers on Hilton Head, which we're looking at. The largest population on Hilton Head until 1974. So this was a major U.S. government installation in the heart of the South. It was the headquarters of the U.S. Army Department of the South, but more importantly, it was the headquarters of the United States Navy South Atlantic Blockading Squadron. So the biggest ships in the Navy were here. And so it became, and that's really where the story of Fort Fremont starts, with that huge Civil War military operations and installations on Hilton Head, on St. Helena Island, on Parris Island, and in Beaufort.
After the Civil War, we're going to see a massive change in technology that's going to revolutionize the military. During the Civil War, we had ironclad ships, we had rifled cannons, but they were all made out of iron, and they were not terribly effective. But its technology is going to change after the Civil War. We're going to see steel produced, and steel is much harder. So now we have a new material to make armor out of for ships. So we can have these armored ships made with steel that are much more resistant to shot. Because I have steel, I can make stronger barrels for my guns. I can rifle and machine these much better, and the rifling is the spirals that are cut in the barrel that allows it to shoot further with more accuracy. And we can also now have breech loading guns that can lock from behind, so I can load my gun from behind. I don't have to go have the old black powder muzzle loading cannon that I had before. Now I can fire much more rapidly. If I compare the gun of 1890 to the guns of 1860, for the same caliber, the same diameter gun, the 1890 gun will be able to fire a projectile that's 4 times heavier, can shoot it 3 times further, can put it in with greater precision, and can put it through much more armor than anything we had in the 1860s. It's a world difference. A military historian, E.R. Lewis, would say that the change between the Civil War and 1890 in artillery technology was the greatest that would be seen since the invention of artillery in the 14th century to the introduction of the nuclear projectile in the 1950s. So there's been a huge change in gun technology. At the same time, it's not just the steel, but also the powder that fires these guns is different. We have new chemical makeup, and sort of like cordite is invented now, and it's still a widely used military explosive even today. Smokeless powder is invented during this period of time. And it's not just chemical composition, but it's the details of how you make the grain, how fast they burn. So much like the skill of firing a solid rocket, solid fuel rocket, it's that same kind of technology that's been developed in these gunpowder and this new powder. So our weapons of this day are much, much greater. They would be the great killing machines of World War I. Most of the casualties on the battlefields of World War I would come from artillery. So the world has seen a huge change in artillery, and that's tied into changes in ships. We now have steel armored ships. They're all steam powered. They are now equipped with these fine long-range guns, and they now become the dominant threat of the late 19th, early 20th century. This is the threat. The French and the English would bombard cities like Cairo and reduce them to rubble because they were unable to defend them. So this is how the world was seeing the threat from this new technology. Big battleships are the threat of the era, and new guns and fortifications on the ground are what you have to defend against them.
One of the most important and first things that happened after the Civil War is they built a railroad to Port Royal Sound, which didn't exist. It was the first connection of the Sea Islands to the mainland. And the advantage of that railroad is it brought coal to Port Royal Sound. So when the coal was delivered, the Navy followed.
In 1872, Robert Smalls was in the South Carolina legislature, and he pushed through a resolution to the Secretary of War calling for them to put a Navy station on Parris Island. And eventually he would go on to Congress, where he would continue his support for a Navy station here in the Beaufort-Port Royal area. They eventually opened a Navy station here and a coaling station.
They created in the 1890s on Parris Island the largest dry dock in the United States. This is the period when the U.S. Navy was switching from sail to steam. All the navies of the world needed a coaling station. This was the principal coaling station, because of the railroad, for the Caribbean and South American U.S. fleets.
This would be the biggest dry dock south of Norfolk. In fact, it is the only dry dock south of Norfolk, Virginia, that's capable of taking these new modern battleships and these new modern armored cruisers. So this becomes, at this point, a strategic Navy base in that it provides coal, and it provides top-line support to the ships, and they can repair the hulls of even the biggest ships in the U.S. Navy. Following the Civil War, national strategy and emphasis in the United States shifted to recovery from war, and all of our coastal fortifications went into neglect. The military was busy taming the West, and coastal defenses became something that was no longer important. In the rest of the world, technology is moving forward, and they're developing these battleships, they're developing new high-quality artillery, and this is going on worldwide. And in 1885, President Grover Cleveland appointed the Endicott Board. This was headed by Secretary of War Endicott, William Endicott, and the board would meet and issue a report in 1886, and they said that the conditions of our coastal defenses were just unbearable. They cannot be allowed to stay like that. And they made recommendations for fortification and improvements. They identified 29 places that needed fortifications, and 11 of which were critical. In that list of 29, Savannah and Charleston are on the list, but Beaufort is not on the list. It'll take international events to bring Beaufort into the play of modern fort technology.
So the USS Maine was here on patrol and in the harbor, and while they were in the harbor several times, they entertained the local population. So the merchants and the social leaders and the political leaders of Beaufort were invited to come have lunch with the captain of the ship, Captain Sigsbee. And the officers got to know the people got to know the officers. The crew, which was large, would go ashore on payday and make friends with everybody in town. So it was a very social arrangement between the towns, Port Royal and Beaufort, and the ship. So the Maine left here. It went and reprovisioned, it refueled in Key West, and then went the 90 miles across to Havana into the harbor and blew up.
This inflamed the already hot passions both in Cuba and here in the United States. At that point, somebody in the War Department realized that we had this big dry dock, the only dry dock in the South that could take on and repair these big capital ships that were in our Navy. We were going to start operations against a power in the Caribbean, and this fort was totally undefended. And that's what put Fort Fremont on the map. We had to have a fort here to defend the coaling station and especially this big dry dock, as well as this fine harbor that's here.
And of course, that event, which killed 300 or more sailors on the ship, was very much followed by the local news media and very much lamented by the many friends that the crew had made here. The destruction of the USS Maine was a personal matter to Beaufort and to Port Royal Sound. And of course, it was the Spanish-American War and the attempt to defend this harbor again, which led to the creation of Fort Fremont. The United States declared war on Spain in April 1898.
And by early May, we had temporary batteries in place here, submarine mines were in place, and in the summer they would actually place the mines across the Beaufort River behind me. The temporary batteries were a temporary expedient. They were located to my left about 1,000 yards. They immediately began construction of what would become Fort Fremont. The large batteries would house the large guns. Battery 4 Nance, the rapid-fire guns, the smaller battery, was completed by June of 1898.
In 1898, everybody in town went to war. They had a naval militia unit, South Carolina Naval Militia Unit, and they were absorbed by the Navy. Many of them ran tugboats from here to New York to Key West, which was the principal support base, Tampa and Key West, for the U.S. Army operations in Cuba.
Peace was declared by the end of 1898, and the remainder of Fort Fremont would not be finished until early 1899, and the first soldiers would arrive from the regular Army at that point in March 1899.
Well, Fort Fremont was named for Major General John Fremont. He was actually a local boy, so to speak. He was born and grew up in Savannah, Georgia, just south of us, and went to college in the College of Charleston, up just north of us in Charleston. He served in the Army, and primarily initially as a explorer, as Army forts were generally named for Army officers, and he was connected locally. This is more than likely why the fort was named for him.
The fort was constructed on a site directly across the river from the Parris Island Naval Station. And the site selected was 170 acres, which included the two artillery batteries. Fort Fremont, of course, had Battery Fornes and Battery Jessup. But then adjacent to the battery site was an administrative quadrangle, a very typical military-type administrative square.
We are sitting in the number 3 gun position of a 3-gun battery, Battery Jessup, which had 3 10-inch disappearing carriage, large caliber guns, breech-loading guns. Their purpose was to engage the warships that might be entering the harbor and Port Royal Sound. We're here now at the 2nd battery that was part of Fort Fremont. This is Battery Fornance, was named for Army officer that was actually killed during the Spanish-American War during the Battle of San Juan Hill. Battery Fornance mounted 2 British-made 4.72-inch Armstrong quick-fire guns. They were called quick-fire because they were loaded with a complete cartridge, and in time of action they could fire 4 to 6 rounds per minute. The purpose of Battery Fornance was to defend the minefield, which was the other component of the Endicott Coast Artillery or Coast Defense System. A minefield with controlled mines, controlled meaning that they were connected electrically to shore and could be fired on command from shore. That control station would have been probably shared with the plotting room. And in order to protect the minefield, obviously an enemy would want to interfere with that, might send vessels, small ships in here at night to try to interfere, and this battery would take those vessels under fire if there was suspected that they were doing something to interfere with the mines, such as pulling up the cables and cutting those.
The Endicott era fort was a formidable technology. It represented state-of-the-art technology, defense technology of its time against the state-of-the-art threat, which would be the battleship.
The life for the soldiers at Fort Fremont was disciplined and regimented. They even had meal times were specified lengths of time, 15 minutes for lunch, 15 minutes at breakfast, 20 minutes at supper. They had to practice their skills. They were training and doing maintenance constantly. If you can imagine, with these big guns, they had to have skills and practice the skills in artillery, mine laying, signaling, which involved, in our case at Fort Fremont, the use of the fire control tower, which was a pretty sophisticated and advanced signaling technique. Then they also had to practice the typical military skills, marching and drilling, small arms fire, first aid, and so forth. In addition to that, they also participated in athletics. They had physical training, PT, and they also had sports teams. So this was to keep them physically fit so that they could continue their duties, because it was pretty rigorous at Fort Fremont.
When eventually the decision was made to move the dry dock and the coaling station and the Navy station up to Charleston, then this fort no longer became significant. There was nothing left here that was to be protected. And at that point, 1911, the last troops were transferred out and the fort was closed.
In 1901, the mayor of Charleston and the United States Senator Pitchfork Ben Tillman from South Carolina wanted this to move from Beaufort County to Charleston County, because there are more votes in Charleston County, and the mayor wanted the U.S. Corps of Engineers and the Navy to dredge the harbor in Charleston, because battleships in those days required 26 feet of water. Charleston's natural harbor is 15 feet of water. Port Royal is 30 feet of water. In order for Charleston to sustain its port, its commercial port, it had to dredge the harbor. Well, if they could get the Navy up there, they get the Corps of Engineers to dredge the harbor. That was the play. And the play for Pitchfork Ben Tillman, the U.S. Senator in 1900, was that he'd get a whole lot more votes from the largest city in South Carolina. So it was a political, commercial operation, and they moved the nation, and it was done, boom, like that.
The fort did its job. It was a deterrent for anybody that wished to attack these. It provided protection. In fact, the whole Endicott system, although never challenged in this era here in the United States, provided some 300 major guns, coastal guns to protect major areas, and left the United States at the beginning of the 20th century with as well-defended coastline as any place in the world.
I would just like to say that it's a magnificent artifact of an era. And it's an era that has been neglected. The turn of the 20th century, the naval station across the river here. And so it's a piece of history that's disappearing, and the Friends of Fort Fremont and Beaufort County have preserved it for the use of the public and as a memorial to that moment in history.
Fort Fremont closes a 350-year story of homeland security addressing European imperialism in the 19th century. It's a tale of how geography, technology, and national security creates a transition for America to become a global power. It's also a wonderful snapshot of America in the beginning of the 20th century. The Friends of Fort Fremont and Beaufort County have a valued partnership working in tandem to preserve the fort's integrity and promote the historical, natural, and cultural aspects of the fort. Most important, we are always looking for creative ways to enhance the visitor experience.
It's civilization versus nature's fury. Raging blizzards bury cities under thousands of tons of snow. Howling hurricanes tear apart coastal communities with wind and rain. And flash floods wipe entire towns off the face of the earth. As the skies clear, people begin to pick up the pieces. But after the storm, insidious damage is still being done. Our most vital natural resource is under assault, our nation's waters.
We're at the Chattahoochee Nature Center, and we're trying to find out what a watershed is. First victim. I need you to tell me what a watershed is. Do you have any idea?
Watershed? A watershed? Where people go to the bathroom? Sweating, I guess.
Something to do with sweating?
Uh-huh.
Like after you run, when
You perspire, yeah.
and then you shed it?
Uh-huh.
We wanted to ask you if you knew what a watershed was.
A watershed?
Yeah.
Is it kind of like the rain?
Do you know what a watershed is?
Shed that holds water.
Come here for a second. I want to ask you something. Do you know what a watershed is?
No. No.
Do you have any idea? What do you think it has something to do with?
I don't know.
What a watershed is?
Yeah.
That's just a drain pool, I guess you'd say, or the drain area. That's where the rainwater drains into the river.
Correct. That's a great answer.
A watershed is that area of land that drains to a body of water, be that if it's a river, a stream, the ocean, an estuary, a bay. Wherever you live drains to some water body, and you live in a watershed. So everyone lives in a watershed.
And in this modern industrial age, our water sources are becoming more contaminated with each passing year.
The biggest water quality problem that we have in the nation today is polluted runoff.
All water east of the Continental Divide drains to the Atlantic, while water west of the divide flows to the Pacific. And one drop of rain can cross many different watersheds along the way. As runoff flows into rivers, streams, and storm drains, the water picks up trash, dirt, bacteria, toxic chemicals, and fertilizers, creating a soup of pollutants that is extremely hazardous to the environment. And the consequences of polluted runoff exist worldwide.
The UN estimate is that there's about 1 billion people on the planet right now who don't have adequate access to fresh water.
97% of all water on Earth is salty ocean water. Of the remaining 3% that's fresh, over 2/3 is frozen in glaciers and polar ice. That leaves less than 1% of all the planet's water for our use.
I predict in the future that some of the U.S. water needs are going to come through pipeline because we have just overused our supply.
To address the complex threats facing U.S. water resources, the Environmental Protection Agency recommends adopting a watershed approach.
We're trying to reconnect some of the river.
It's a method that looks at each watershed for its own unique set of environmental challenges and solutions.
In many cases, people mistakenly identify large discharge pipes in the water as the problem. But that may not be the problem. It may be coming from agricultural runoff. It may be coming from stormwater runoff over parking lots and impervious surfaces. Every watershed is different, and you need to look at each watershed in its own terms and then think systematically about how you remediate, how you clean up that watershed.
In California, the Santa Monica Bay watershed drains a dangerous amount of polluted runoff after each storm.
When it rains, literally the whole residue of urban living ends up getting washed into the storm drain system and ends up going straight into the bay on Santa Monica Bay's beaches with no treatment whatsoever.
It's actually like a giant toilet flushing because all of the pollution, the dog mess has been building up and building up and building up. When it rains, it just flushes into the storm drain and goes directly into the surf.
In 1996, the Santa Monica Bay Restoration Commission proved there was a link between the contaminated runoff in the Santa Monica Bay and reports of illness afflicting people who swim there.
What we did find was at the outlets of storm drains, no matter where they were up and down the bay, if there was a flow of runoff into the surf zone, those people that were swimming in those areas definitely experienced higher incidences of illnesses.
The pollutants in the water affect surfers because we're actually the indicator species with all the pollutants. When we are in the waters, we're ingesting it through our skin and our mouth. Even if people don't take a swallow of water, it's still getting into our systems, our ears, any orifice in your body. And it causes infections, it can cause colds, sore throats at the very least.
I wouldn't want to swim in water that's got those diseases in there, just floating around, making more diseases.
I've seen it pretty much as bad as it can be. I've seen crap floating out in the water, literally.
Generically, we call it fecal coliform. More specifically, you might know of it as E. coli, salmonella, or enterococcus. Whatever's in poop.
There's times when it tastes funky, for sure.
Every day, the city and county of Los Angeles perform a battery of tests to keep the public informed about water quality in the Santa Monica Bay. Cesar Arzadan begins the monitoring process each morning by taking a series of coastline water samples. Then it's back to the lab for analysis.
Most of the bacteria that you're going to see, it comes from feces. And when you put it under the UV light, you're going to see a different kind of color. It's a fluorescent sign that there is a bacteria, and that one is called E. coli. That one definitely is feces from animals, or it could be humans also.
The results are reported to the health department, and beach warnings are posted as necessary.
The number of beach postings has decreased, and 85% of the beaches that have been monitored in California have received either A or B grades, and that's significantly different than 4 years ago.
But while progress is being made in California, the harmful effects of polluted runoff are a growing concern everywhere. So what can the average person do to help reduce pollution in our watersheds?
How you apply pesticides or not in your garden, how you wash your cars, making sure that you don't throw cigarette butts out onto the street.
Do not dump things on the ground, especially oils or any chemical pollutants. Pick up after your dogs. A lot of people don't realize how important that is. And just be a conscientious citizen and don't leave anything on the ground.
I think one person can make a difference and needs to make the difference. If not you, who?
Coming up.
We're heading for what's known as an ecosystem collapse.
Can the Gulf of Mexico be saved from polluted runoff? It was a flood of apocalyptic scale. 26,000 square miles of the lower Mississippi Valley inundated by water. More than 200 lives lost, and 600,000 people displaced from their homes. The flood of 1927 was the most disastrous in U.S. history, and its effects are still felt today. After the flood of 27, massive levees were put in place. And while they helped protect the lower Mississippi River basin from flooding, the levees and other human activities would ultimately harm the watershed in unforeseen ways. The Gulf state of Louisiana is the terminus of the Mississippi River, the mighty watershed that drains 41% of the area of the lower 48 states into the Gulf of Mexico.
We receive water from as far away as Montana, Michigan, to Pennsylvania, Ohio, Iowa. All those waters drain right past this area right here.
But by the time all that water enters the Gulf, it has accumulated enough contaminants from polluted runoff to create an enormous hypoxic zone, an area of water lacking in vital oxygen.
The size of the low oxygen zone in the Gulf of Mexico is about 9,000 square miles. That's equal to the size of the state of New Jersey.
The shortage of oxygen is killing fish and other sea life and could potentially have a devastating effect on the regional economy.
We are the largest navigation port in the United States. We are the second largest in the world. We have the largest fishery in this country.
When we was crabbing, a lot of times all our crabs we did, we can't even sell them.
The reason hypoxia should be of concern to most citizens in this nation is because it's a sign. It's a sign of the degradation of our water resources.
We're heading for what's known as an ecosystem collapse.
If you're going to have an ecological disaster caused by the offshore hypoxic areas, then that absolutely translates into an economic disaster.
So what exactly is causing this dead zone in the Gulf? Hypoxia develops when an area of water receives excess pollutants, primarily an overabundance of nutrients, which produce large algae blooms that die off and lead to low oxygen. And since the Mississippi gets fed by tributaries that flow through 31 states, that adds up to a staggering volume of contaminated runoff.
You have drainage into the Gulf of Mexico from the Ohio River, the Mississippi River, and the Missouri River. Yet each of those three major river systems are watersheds in and of themselves with their own challenges and their own problems.
The Mississippi River has always delivered a lot of water, and that hasn't changed over the centuries. What's changed is the amount of nutrients in that water.
In fact, the Mississippi's nitrogen levels in the lower Mississippi River have tripled since the 1950s, and the growing hypoxic zone off the Louisiana coast contains the disturbing evidence.
It's like a rusty color, stinky, rotten looking. You see fish just swimming sideways, gasping for air and stuff like that. And when you pull up the nets, not one shrimp alive, all dead, orange. The fish, they rotten, like melting away and stuff like that. Can't breathe stuff, and it's just rotten.
This is just a fact of life, the way we treat our water systems, because we use them as our garbage dumps. We use them to dilute our pollutants and things like that, and it flows downstream. I believe the statistic is that if you're in New Orleans, the water that is going by you has passed through a human gut something like 3 or 4 times before it gets to you.
Incredibly, Louisiana boasts a natural resource that removes pollutants from the draining Mississippi, the once abundant wetlands.
Plants that grow in wetlands produce these wonderful filters for everything that is coming into them. They trap sediment, they tempt chemicals, and what leaves the wetlands is much, much cleaner water.
Wetlands also provide an important habitat for birds and other wildlife. Sadly, the Louisiana wetlands are quickly disappearing.
Coastal Louisiana has lost about 1.2 million acres of wetlands in the last 100 years.
When we levied off the Mississippi, It cut off the Mississippi River water from the marshes.
In addition to the levees, a network of man-made navigation channels is also compromising the wetlands by allowing salt water to seep into the marshes.
Once that salt water travels up these channels and overflows the banks of these channels out into freshwater systems, such as this cypress swamp, that salt water sits out there around the roots of these trees and kills them. They cannot survive salt water. They're freshwater plants.
Eliminating the hypoxic zone will take more than saving our wetlands. Reducing nutrient runoff in the Mississippi River watershed is the heart of the problem. It's an issue involving over half the states in the nation and a vast array of industries, particularly farming, which uses nitrogen-rich fertilizer to grow its crops.
Fertilizers are helping the United States produce the food for the world, but there is such a thing as overuse.
There are scientists who have done the analyses and predict that you could reduce fertilizers by about 12% without reducing crop production and see a significant decrease in the amount of nitrogen going into the Mississippi River.
Experts say the first key to changing behavior is raising public awareness.
We all live downstream of somebody, and we all live upstream of somebody. So what somebody else does in their watershed affects the water that I receive, and what I do in my watershed affects the water that somebody else receives downstream.
If we don't clean up our act, our water resources, which we simply cannot live without, will be ruined. Coming up, can the water supply for 9 million New Yorkers be saved from the ravages of polluted runoff? In January of 1996, one of the most devastating winter storms in history slams the East Coast. 2 feet of snow dumps on New York and throughout the Northeast Corridor. Schools, airports, and roads are shut down. By the time it's over, the blizzard and resultant flooding caused $3 billion in losses, and 187 lives are taken. And in the Catskill Mountains of upstate New York, the snowmelt triggers another potentially devastating crisis. Stormwater runoff, contaminated with trash, dirt, fertilizers, and pesticides from nearby farms and communities, threatens the fresh water supply. And the Catskill system of reservoirs is vitally important, for it is the biggest watershed of New York City, providing drinking water to over 9 million people.
The miracle of the city's water supply system is largely unknown to most New Yorkers. You ask people, where does the water come from? Often people shrug their shoulders and say New Jersey.
I figured that we were probably our own separate water system than from upstate. I'd rather be drinking water from upstate than the Hudson River.
I don't know that most people are aware of how large the problem is and how close to crisis many of our water supply systems are.
To preserve the purity of the reservoirs and enforce the Safe Drinking Water Act, the Environmental Protection Agency presented the Big Apple with 2 options. Either build and maintain a $6 billion facility to filter all of the city's tap water, or fund a $1 billion program to protect the watershed from polluted runoff.
When it comes to our investment in clean air and clean water, preserving open space, fixing antiquated sewage treatment plants, we can't wait. It doesn't get any less expensive, it gets more expensive.
With the historic Watershed Agreement of 1997, an unprecedented upstate-downstate partnership was forged to protect the New York City water supply.
The Watershed Agreement is saving New York City billions of dollars.
The plan includes purchasing and preserving 355,000 acres of undeveloped watershed land, the upgrading of sewage treatment plants, and the protection and restoration of stream corridors.
What we're looking at here is a main tributary of the Esopus Creek. During flooding, we were seeing a lot of sediment coming out of the stream. The clay gets into the water column and it becomes very turbid, and then it makes it very difficult to treat and clean that water. So from a water quality perspective, we're very concerned about erosion.
The program also provides funding for farmers that implement agriculture management practices.
Well, we have a very exciting program with the Watershed Agricultural Council where we are working with local farmers. We look at how they're handling the animals so that the runoff associated with manure, fertilizer, and that farm activity isn't getting into the streams around our reservoirs.
This water here is basically the water you're going to be drinking down in the city. And I feel I've got a responsibility to try my best to keep it clean for when it gets down there. It used to be when it rained here on the farm, the water that ran away from the
back of the barn here was full of mud, manure, and it would just run brown and right into the stream. 2 years ago, we would spread every day. We'd have to take it out, spread it on the fields. If the snow was deep, we spread it on the snow, and unfortunately, if the ground was froze when the snow melted, the nutrient value of it for fertilizer was gone. It wound up down in the reservoir.
With New York City funding, a secure above-ground steel tank that can hold 400,000 gallons of manure was installed on the Meadowbrook farm.
That's enough storage for 6 months of the year. Now we can store it, spread it when it'll do the most good to us for fertilizer, and we don't have to spread it every day.
I worked with Tim on the plan to develop the improvements we're going to make. Plan really belongs to the farmer, and it's a collaboration of their ideas and what technical advice we can bring to the program. But the farmer makes the decision.
It's a program that seems to make everybody happy.
Here's to the...
And at over 1,000 sampling stations throughout the city.
New York City has probably one of the most extensive water quality monitoring programs in the nation, if not the world.
We're sampling every day, 365 days a year. I've been drinking this water for 53 years. Nothing else. Best water in the world. New York City, straight from the tap to my lips.
Coming up, the future of our water supply remains at risk, but there's something everyone can do to help protect it. Find out how next. To keep our watersheds free of pollutants will require the actions of every citizen, community, and business.
Paved concrete surfaces, asphalt, parking lots, sidewalks. The question is, do we need to have as many as we do? Because to the extent that you have too much impervious surface, the water is not retained on site. It doesn't soak into the ground. It runs off, picks up speed, carries pollutants and contaminants into the water body.
One strategy for preventing stormwater runoff is occurring at the new Ford Rouge Center in Dearborn, Michigan. This remodeled truck plant is covered by a green roof the size of 8 football fields. Planted with a porous ground cover, it reduces the amount of polluted runoff released into the watershed.
The thing that tends to get the most attention is the 10-acre green roof, but that's really just part of a philosophy that if an area does not have to be paved or built upon, it's going to be green space.
And communities are also implementing green space strategies, such as rain gardens.
They sloped the lot in such a manner that all the flow goes towards this landscaping, where basically the polluted runoff can percolate into the ground and get filtered rather than going straight onto the street into the storm drain system, and really a very simple approach to cleaning up our runoff in urban areas.
But perhaps the most powerful course of action is individual participation.
People need to take responsibility for the state of our waters, and water conservation is one area where they can do that as a committed citizen. All those things your mom told you, take a short shower, don't let the water tap run while you're brushing your teeth.
Taking your household hazardous waste to a cleanup and recycling day. Don't wash your car on the streets and put all those suds down into the drain.
When you change or use motor oil, you don't dump it into the street. Everybody's got to clean up after their pets. Obviously, that's a big concern. Fertilizers, herbicides, pesticides, make sure you don't use them anytime there's any chance of rain coming up in the near future. When you're irrigating your lawn and your garden, make sure that you're not overspraying and causing all those chemicals to end up getting into the storm drain system. The only way we're going to solve the problem is if everybody does their part.
We all live in a watershed. We all have an impact on our environment. And we must all play a role in the protection and restoration of our valuable water resources. To learn more about how you can get involved and to get a free brochure called After the Storm, visit epa.gov/Weather Channel.
Dr. Gates, tell me a little bit about the timeliness of the Reconstruction series. Why now?
12 years of black freedom, followed by an alt-right rollback,
a president immediately following Abraham Lincoln who refused to renounce white supremacy, a conservative Supreme Court that effectively undid the power of the 14th and 15th Amendments. What's that sound like?
Contemporary times.
Contemporary times. So it was obvious that we could teach our fellow citizens in America about the perilous moment in which we're living by analogy through telling the story of Reconstruction and its rollback. And I first started thinking about it after the horrible murders of Reverend Clementa Pinckney and the other innocents at Mother Emanuel Church, because the justifications that Dylann Roof summoned for his actions were very reminiscent of racist rhetoric about black people immediately following the Civil War and following Reconstruction. And I was shocked. It's almost like a horror movie when you think that the vampire's dead and all of a sudden they come up out of the casket and you think, damn, I thought I put a stake in your heart. I thought that the worst and most pernicious, heinous aspects of anti-black white supremacy were long gone, and I was naive about that. And we've seen a rise in hate speech, anti-Semitism, anti-gay attitudes, and when people become frightened, particularly about their economic future, they look for scapegoats. And the scapegoats traditionally have been Jewish people, women, gay people, and of course in this country, people of color. So it's a moral, a lesson. Let's don't go back to what happened with the rollback to Reconstruction.
Reconstruction is such an important part of American history, and yet it is so misunderstood. Why is that? Why is it that we don't have a better understanding of this period and what it actually meant?
Well, W.E. Du Bois wrote a book in 1935 called Black Reconstruction. And one chapter is called The Propaganda of History. And he analyzes how white historians had written about Reconstruction. And that was part of the rollback, to create a mythology of black incompetence, that black men had been elected to office and couldn't properly serve, that black voters had been manipulated by northern scallywags and carpetbaggers, that basically they were tools and pawns, that they were dishonest. Robert Smalls was one of the greatest heroes of the Civil War and Reconstruction, served 5 non-consecutive terms in Congress because he was constantly being accused yet of stealing money and misappropriating funds. There was a mythology sanctioned by the discipline of history located at Columbia University called the Dunning School, led by historian Professor Dunning. And they found every way to traduce the achievements of black people. And that has only been undone by historians since Du Bois published Black Reconstruction, and most notably under the leadership of another Columbia professor, Professor Eric Foner, with whom we made our Reconstruction series. He was our chief consultant. Plus, we have over 40 historians doing modern, cutting-edge scholarship on Reconstruction, whom we feature in the series. So it's very much a collective series, and it's very much a counterpoint to the received interpretations of Reconstruction fabricated by the Dunning School.
Well, for us,
this is the Foner School.
The Foner School. For us in South Carolina, it has a very special meaning. Why is the state of South Carolina so pivotal to an understanding of Reconstruction?
South Carolina was ground zero for Reconstruction because it was a majority black state. There's a famous 1872 lithograph of the first colored senator and the members of the House of Representatives, and 3 of those men in that lithograph were from South Carolina. When Richard T. Greener graduated from Harvard, the first black man to graduate from Harvard in the class of 1870, where was the land of opportunity? Was it in New York? Was it in Boston? Was it in Philadelphia? Charleston. Came to Charleston and went to Columbia and served on the faculty and took law classes there. A black man from England, from Liverpool, England, Robert Brown Elliott, came to Boston in 1867 with the British Navy, could smell the opportunity, headed straight to South Carolina and worked for Richard Harvey Kane's newspaper, then was elected to Congress. Very eloquent man. And this was where it was at. This is where it was happening. And when I interviewed Representative Clyburn, his office in the Congress.
Well, he's long been a student of Reconstruction.
Yeah, I mean, it's like a museum. You go in there and all these brothers are on the wall. And we talked about the fact that South Carolina had a black majority in the House of Representatives. You can't imagine that now. South Carolina, even in the 18th century, was called Negro country. It was a black state. And very soon that was dismantled. So it's no surprise that many of the most vicious battles over race occurred here, because it was an attempt to control this black majority. I went to Calhoun College at Yale University, and John C. Calhoun was an intellectual racist. He not only wanted slavery to continue, he wanted to resurrect the slave trade. He was a rough brother.
What do you feel were the most important and most significant aspects of Reconstruction, the real positives?
The establishment of black social institutions, particularly the churches, fraternal organizations, social organizations, the fact that so many of the slaves wanted to get married and legalize their love relationships, the taking out of ads in newspapers to reunite families, and the fact that 80% of the eligible black men in the South registered to vote in what I call the first Freedom Summer, the summer of 1867, and 500,000 of them cast their votes in the general election of 1868 for Ulysses S. Grant. That's amazing. And people formed schools, historically black, what we now call historically black colleges and universities like Shaw and Howard, but elementary schools.
And in South Carolina, Allen and Benedict and Claflin.
Absolutely. And, you know, just elementary schools that the slaves had a hunger for learning, because they knew that the most valuable thing that had been kept for them was knowledge of reading and writing. And they knew that was the pathway to success.
Isn't it interesting that public education grew out of this period, and particularly was spearheaded here in our state by Robert Smalls?
Right. There weren't statewide public school systems. And the Reconstruction governments, particularly in South Carolina, and particularly as designed by Robert Smalls, established statewide public school educational systems, which hadn't been done before, which is a shock to people. And that's because black people understood the value of education.
It's also interesting, though, that things like public education and certainly enfranchisement and economic development, all these positives that grew out of the Reconstruction period are still under assault in modern times.
Yeah, it is. And we have to, any society is judged by the quality of its public education. And we as Americans should be embarrassed at how we've allowed our public schools, which are populated by brilliant teachers who are so motivated, but they're underpaid and under-resourced. And we should be ashamed of that.
You know, people have a general idea that the collapse of Reconstruction was solely in the hands of the South. That's not true, is it?
No. The collapse of Reconstruction was a conspiracy between economic interests and political interests in the North and in the South. They said 12 years is enough. There was the economic panic of 1873, which was called the First Great Depression. And people looked around and said, why we spend all the money on these Negroes in the South? Let them thrive. They're free now. And they acted barrel as if 200 years of slavery could be wiped out with no reparations, with no benefits given, no 40 acres and a mule, no help
that each of these people were on their own. Not only that, new forms of oppression were institutionalized. Debt peonage, sharecropping.
The rise of the Klan.
The rise of the coup, terrorism. And so very much Reconstruction is about issues that still roil our society today. Who has the right to be a citizen? Who has the right to be an American? What is the relationship between political and economic democracy, and what is the role of terrorism in the healthy functioning of a democracy? What's the role of the chief executive in the face of the manifestations of terrorism?
How can we have this very blatant reminder from 150 years ago and not be mindful of its impact today?
That's why Dylan McGee and I made this series. And with PBS, we'll get, and I am on the road. You know, I flew down to Beaufort from Harvard. I did my official duties. I jumped on JetBlue and came down here because I wanted a South Carolina screening to remind people that this is ground zero, that then is now. And I want to do one in Charleston, and I want to do one at the Penn Center as well. It is very important that the country understand that we made this series about the current racial climate in the United States, though it's through the mirror and the analogy of Reconstruction and its rollback called redemption.
One final question. What is the measure of success for you for this series?
First of all, I want Reconstruction modules. First, I want Reconstruction modules to be created in the classroom so that Reconstruction is as central to a course in American history as the Civil War is, or World War I or World War II. Reconstruction was our first experiment with interracial democracy, and it was crushed. And the only way that we're going to survive as a society is if we fashion forms of interracial democracy and collaboration that allow a multiplicity of voices, sexual orientations, religious beliefs, etc., gender identities, to thrive and live in harmony and peace. That's my goal in creating this series, and I hope people will watch it.
Dr. Henry Louis Gates, Jr., thank you.
Thank you. I can talk to you all day. Always a pleasure.
In probably 2006, right around there, we were starting to see the growth affect our small town, coming west off of Hilton Head and moving its way into Bluffton. And Bluffton was just this small, somewhat of a square mile, but growing. So we decided to put some money and a lot of our efforts into what is called the Old Town Master Plan. It was adopted in 2006, and it really is a blueprint for all of our policies, improvements in our historic district. So the Garvin House is behind us. It is a historical structure. It's probably the last freedman's cottage that's on the river. So you look at it and people think, tear it down. Well, again, if you go back to this Old Town Master Plan, it would tell you, enhance your structures. Put your time and effort and your money into places that can't be duplicated.
My wife and I live here in Bluffton. And this has been a piece of property that we've looked at since about 2008, and before the restoration and renovation started, and something that we've been interested in seeing progress over time. Well, it's very interesting. The house has been called the Garvin House for just kind of folklore vernacular. And as Melanie Marks, my wife, went through the genealogy, it became clear that his real name was Cyrus Garvey, but through transfer of deeds and the way people wrote things, that his name is actually Cyrus Garvey. But it took on Garvin, and at times you see Garvin, at times you see Garvey,
but his real name, as you track back his family and so forth, is truly Cyrus Garvey.
You know, the history says that he built the house in 1870, shortly after, you know, his freedom, on property that belonged to Joseph Baynard, who was a plantation owner. His summer home was here on this property, but his plantation was near or possibly in the bounds of Palmetto Bluff, the development. And somehow Cyrus was able to work this land, build his house in 1870, but didn't get deeded the property until 1880 by Joseph Baynard. When you think about this house and he was living here and the view that he had, it's amazing.
My wife and I got together and we said, we have to become part of this somehow. We have to come down here and spend time here and try and facilitate and bring more awareness to the fact that this is important. This is history, and how could we help?
Well, what brings us to Bluffton is this magnificent house here, the Garvin House. We've been working as director of the Palmetto Trust. I'm all over the state working with municipalities and communities, and this has been on our radar ever since I came on in 2007. This was an amazing story of this family after freedom were able to build their own lives here in their own property. This is kind of a unique situation because most of the properties we work with do get turned into private homes. This is one where it really is going to be like a museum situation where the place is saved and the community can participate in learning about it, and the town can leverage it as part of their historic character that is so known in Bluffton so well.
Basically, when we took over this project, there was a stabilization project, which basically means where these 6x6s cribbing carries a steel beam that pretty much runs through the length of the house. So you've got one here, and you've got one pretty much that runs down the center, and this was basically to give support, because you can see the structure got to the point of where it really couldn't stand by itself. Now, this is new product, but what we've done is we were able to salvage all of the original flooring. So we basically removed it from the house, wrapped it up, documented it, numbered it so that it can go back down in the same place. And what we'll end up doing is painting the plywood floor black so that you can't see down through the cracks, and it gives the illusion of what it used to look like. We'll install as much of the original stuff as possible. Same thing with the siding. So you can see it's not too hard to pull down. It's almost completely off. But we'll take this down, photograph it, document it, and we put it back in the same place. This is some of the original old beam, and basically it's anywhere from 6 inches to 6.5 inches because it's all rough hewn. It was all done by axe and basically or hand saw, so it's not perfect. So it's got a little bit of a stammer, a little bit of a wave here and there. So we've interlocked and tied it in. When we dug the footing, we came across a lot of interesting things. So just various bottles, little baby perfume bottles and things like that, just, you know, that would be, you know, precious to them back in the day. And these are some of the old original lids from the cannery, from the oyster factory. I kind of always enjoyed the challenge of looking at something and trying to look at, okay, why did they do this, or how did it develop into this, and how it progressed and changed. And just even standing here, you notice that this is exterior siding. So the original structure used to end here. That was the original back door, had a front porch on the front side. So as time progressed, they needed more room. They basically just notched in, added to the foundation, brought a new roof out, and now this became basically another room, bedroom, living room area, kind of a kitchen area here. And obviously you're not running down to Home Depot and Lowe's. You can see they actually just went down to the beach, got sand, and basically mixed a sand mortar, and you can see some of the oyster shell pieces in it and things like that. Just, that's amazing. What they would do is basically, because of the fact we've got a heavy-duty foundation like we have now, and this used to be basically what they would do is take a cypress stump, hopefully cypress because it would last longer, and this is 1870, but they would bury this into the ground, and then they would start all of their heavy beam and framing and basically sit on top of this. You have milestones every day, and you think after, you know, I've been doing it for close to 30 years, that, you know, it's different every day and it's a challenge. So we have a staircase that was intact. So instead of having to remove it, we kind of kept it in place. We worked under it, around it, in it, and we temporarily secured this thing 8 different times while we put the floor system under it. This basically is our racks. So when we actually physically take something off the structure, we want to know where it is and what it went. So what we would do is we would physically remove it, photograph, and then we would go ahead and just label this piece, what side of the house it was on, where it was at, and it basically gives us a guide to put this giant puzzle, you know, back together again.
This is a restoration. Most of the type of things that are done a renovation or rehabilitation that allows them to be modern use. We do have modern codes that had to be implemented here because of its public access, but every effort was made to try to ensure it communicated what these people had to build. So we didn't put in these big brick piers underneath that would have been normal. We just using wooden stumps. This is what they had. But everything is worked to give the aesthetic look of the type of house this thing would have been when it was built.
To capture a point in time, to capture what it would have been like. Again, this is a piece of a broader picture. To capture what a family, Cyrus Garvey was living in here with his wife and children in these reclaimed wood. At the time it was reclaimed, it could have been taken from houses that were burned after the war ended. And put this together where he lived, and then that's why the genealogy and the history of him and his family is so important, because it isn't just a building. It's a man and his family in a time of our history with a building and a community at a time of movement. And so you want to make it as real as possible.
It communicates a time and place that not many places do anymore. You know, when in the low country where you have such development pressures, usually little wooden boxes like this get destroyed and lost. And so this communicates something post-Civil War, post-enslavement. You know, it's about these people surviving and overcoming enslavement into a place of freedom and their niche in property and their own house. And that transitional story is not told enough in the state, and we're so glad it could be done here.
The biggest challenge, again, as you know, is working in all of the old lumbers and things like that. We're to the exciting part of it now. We're basically done with the framing. Now we're kind of putting the puzzle back together. You get a feel for when they actually put it together, and you can see their frustrations when they ran out of a particular species of lumber or something to use, and they just changed it up and still kept going and pushed forward. I knew the house would be here when we get back, just the methodical way that we put it back together. My biggest concern was these beautiful oak trees that have surrounded this. That was the scary part, because I did come down here 3 days after the storm, and there was trees and power lines down. I couldn't even see the house. I got down the road as far as I could and looked at the house, and I was like, oh my gosh. It just blew me away that the thing was still here, high and dry, no leaks, no nothing, no damage. And that was just, you know, lucky, very lucky.
In November of this year, I presented the town with our finished report. And I know the town is planning on using that material to promote the history of the house through brochures, through, you know, signage, to make it a true destination for tourists. I think we have to applaud the Bluffton Preservation Society for knowing the value and of the historic integrity of this house for the town.
In this community and in this country these days is a very important thing, because there's so much strife and there's so much conflict and friction. To actually have a community like this say, this is important. It's important to put our money here, and it's important to show how people over time did work together and respect each other, and we're resurrecting not only a house, but really a legacy for an individual that rose above a big, challenging time.
At last, the memorable 7th dawned upon us, bright and serene. Not a ripple upon the broad expanse of water to disturb the accuracy of fire from the broad decks of that magnificent armada. 2 o'clock had now arrived. when I noticed our men coming out of the fort, which they had bravely defended for 4.5 hours against fearful odds. The Battle of Port Royal, it is true, has been lost.
On November 7, 1861, Confederate forces were defeated at the Battle of Port Royal, one of the first naval battles of the Civil War. Hilton Head and later Beaufort and Port Royal fell to Union troops. Planters abandoned the Sea Islands and thousands of enslaved people escaped from bondage. Hilton Head Island became the headquarters for the U.S. Army's Department of the South. By February 1862, there were over 600 former slaves seeking refuge in Union Army camps on the island. Major General Ormsby Mitchell proposed to create a town for the escaped slaves on Confederate General Thomas Drayton's Fish Hole Plantation. The town was called Mitchellville.
We're standing on Hilton Head Island in the encampment of Mitchellville. It was a freedmen's village built in November of 1862.
These were people who were descendants of slaves who'd been enslaved in this country for over 400 years, never knew what it was to be free. But when General Ormsby Mitchell gave the direction that this town should be built, that it would be a great experiment in freedom for people.
Mitchellville was a very large, planned, built community. It was at least 2 miles long by about 1 mile wide, several hundred houses. Just this part of the site we're working on now had at least 36 or 38 houses on it.
The new residents of Mitchellville set to work building their own homes. They built a church, elected town officials, developed laws, and required every child to attend school. Mitchellville was the first self-governed freedmen's community in the United States.
So they built a town, which I understand had broad boulevards, houses were on quarter-acre lots. They themselves built the houses that they lived in from the materials that were given to them by the United States Army. And to think that they were the ones who created the first compulsory education system in the South.
The people of Mitchellville worked for the Union Army during the war and the subsequent occupation. When the Army left Hilton Head in 1868, most jobs went with it. Mitchellville soon declined from nearly 3,000 residents to just a few families. By 1880, it ceased to be a town. By the mid-1950s, only Hilton Head's older residents remembered Mitchellville and its important history.
The story of Mitchellville never really went away. However, over the years, as older persons died who were more familiar with more historical details, it was passed on to others. However, it was never really pushed very, very hard. There's still a need to reacquaint the current new generation. All of the new residents of Hilton Head need to be totally aware of the rich, true history of Hilton Head.
In the 1980s, archaeologists found remnants of Mitchellville and recorded it as an archaeological site. The site was listed on the National Register of Historic Places in 1988. In 2012, extension of the Hilton Head Airport runway required archaeologists to return to Mitchellville and study areas that would be affected by construction.
There's a lot that we know about Mitchellville, but there's very much that we don't know. We have good maps of Mitchellville as it was laid out, as the streets were laid out in a grid and the houses were built on it. There were different buildings, but we don't know specifically where each building was. We know where some of the stockyards and the cattle pens and different facilities were, but we don't know if individual houses were actually constructed. Was this a concept map that this was the plan that they intended to build, or is it actually what was built. It was simply the map, a document of what was actually there in 1864. That's one of the research questions that we're trying to answer out here on our archaeological site.
Although photographs, maps, and historical accounts give us glimpses of Mitchellville, there are many questions about how the town was built and what day-to-day life at Mitchellville was like that only
We're here at part of the historic Mitchellville, and what you see around you is a series of 2 meter by 2 meter excavation units put together in what we call a block. We're trying to uncover as much of this house that we think is here as possible.
What we're finding is where these houses are or where the artifacts are. In some sites there's stuff scattered all over the place. That's not the case in Mitchellville. Mitchellville is really maybe 20 years at the most of occupation, and then it's gone. It's dissipated as a town. That's another question. Did some people live on past the 1880s, and where did they choose to live?
Features are soil stains, architectural remnants, storage pits, and garbage dumps. Archaeologists discovered 85 features at Mitchellville.
You see the nice sharp edges on this? This is a hole that's been dug and then filled full of garbage, some other thing. We've scraped off that plaza on that overburden. This tan soil has never been disturbed by humans before. This soil has. That's a filled in hole.
Archaeologists want to know about the social and economic choices people made, the kinds of household goods they had, the kinds of foods they ate, and how they organized their homes and lives.
You had people that were moving from enslavement had nothing to a free market economy. They had to spend their money on food and clothing and the things that everybody needs to live, but they're having money to spend. They had disposable income for the first time. So one of the interesting questions that we as archaeologists want to know is, what were they buying? What did they choose to buy with their money? That's
The field investigations are just the first step in the work being done to study this portion of Mitchellville. All of the data and artifacts gathered during this work will be analyzed and interpreted. The results will be presented in a written report that can be shared with other researchers and the public.
I must say that when I visited the archaeology site, I was awed. I didn't expect to see the expanse of work that was going on. And when you think about all that's being uncovered, I felt as if I was on hallowed ground.
I'm a person that I have to see and touch. And when I have something tangible in my hands and I can just feel it, and I was able to share that yesterday with having a piece in my hand, it was amazing. It was amazing.
In the future, the Mitchellville Preservation Project plans to develop an extensive living history park to interpret daily life at historic Mitchellville.
So what I see Mitchellville being is a place where students in all of the schools in Beaufort County can come on field trips and experience what it was like then.
We're very pleased that Mitchellville, as seen today, is coming alive again in history, in reality. There is a great need for Mitchellville story to be in the textbooks, and of course to become a major part of the American history, a part of the history that all Americans can enjoy and continue to appreciate, because we see it as the dawn of freedom here on Hilton Head.
Here's what's happening in Beaufort County.
Port Royal Sound is unique. The largest ships in the world
could sail into Port Royal Sound, and that's what Jean Ribaut, the French explorer, said. Said all the ships of France, nay, all the ships of the world, could safely ride in its bounds. It's very deep and very unusual, and if you're a sailor and you go up and down the coast on the Inland Passage, you come into Port Royal Sound, you know it's different. You can smell it. It's 60 feet deep in the middle of Port Royal Sound, 30 feet deep over the bar. And the interesting thing to me is that the shape of the entrance has not changed for 500 years.
Millions of shells, left by native inhabitants over thousands of years, attest to the bounty of its waters. Clovis points, which are more than 10,000 years old, have been unearthed on its shores. Inevitably, the natural riches of the sea islands surrounding Port Royal Sound attracted the great empires of the 17th and 18th centuries. First, Spain arrived in 1521. Then France came ashore in 1562. Finally, the British claimed them as Carolina in 1663, the land of Charles. After barely surviving a deadly clash with the Native Americans, the settlers demanded protection from the colonial government. Their log fort in Beauforttown had been burned. They felt defenseless.
And it was in that early period, in this early 1720s, that the people of Beaufort said, we need a fort to protect us. So they built this to protect the Inland Passage before it got to Beaufort, which is the reason for the location of what eventually became Fort Frederick, or Fort Prince Frederick.
The new fort began to take shape in 1726 after the famous settler Colonel John Barnwell, better known as Tuscarora Jack, returned from England with the Independent Company afoot, a regiment of British regulars. For the next 7 years, Fort Prince Frederick, a small structure measuring just 125 feet by 75 feet, existed as a typical frontier-style log and earthen fort. Artillery stood at the ready to slow any approach by the Spanish fleet. As soon as the first warnings from the watch cannons at the mouth of the Sound were fired, the militia would be dispatched. Still, the settlers of the islands envisioned something sturdier, a structure that could offer them real protection in times of trouble.
The people kept petitioning the Commons House Assembly and the colonial government for more money to finish the fort and build it more stoutly.
In 1773, the French Huguenot settler and contractor John de la Barre was hired to devise a more substantial structure.
And he said, I'll build a fort of oyster shell and lime, which is what we see there today. And he built the fort, and as it was described in 1733, it was 5 feet thick and 5 feet high. That's pretty stout.
The fort was named for the eldest son of King George II of England.
So Fort Prince Frederick, which is its formal name, was built in 1726, completed in 1733, probably abandoned by 1740. It had that short a history. And for the first 7 years of its existence, 1726 to 1733, it was the southern frontier of English North America.
And although the British occupied Port Royal for a time during the American Revolution, the greatest battle waged by Fort Prince Frederick over the next century and a half was one with the weeds and the weather. A planter by the name of John Joyner Smith came into possession of the land early in the 1800s, turning the expanse above the old fort into fields of cotton tended by the enslaved. But all that changed in November of 1861, when Union forces overcame the Confederate territory.
When the Battle of Port Royal Sound happened in the fall of 1861, and the planters from the Beaufort region skedaddled, as they call it, they left behind between 8,000 and 10,000 slaves.
The people were so jubilant when they heard the cannons go off, because there were about 55 ships coming into that area, that they called it Big Gun Shoot Day. And when they heard the big gun shoot, they said, freedom is here, the Yankees are here, so we're free.
but that area on those bluffs above Fort Frederick is where there'll be camps again throughout the war. And there'll be everything from artillery to infantry encamped, both white and black troops throughout the area. They will build a pier over top of the walls of Fort Frederick out into the Beaufort River.
Over the top of Old Fort Frederick stepped the 1st Black Regiment, mustered in as the 1st South Carolina of African descent.
It's going to be in the summer of 1862, everything sort of begins to change, and permission is given to begin raising black regiments at that time.
President Abraham Lincoln sent a military governor to Port Royal.
General Rufus Saxton is given permission to begin raising upwards of 5,000 black troops. And one of the first things he does is he orders them to assemble at the Smith Plantation, and that will become their camp, and eventually it will be named Camp Saxton in his honor.
Dozens of missionaries, teachers, and physicians from the northeast part of the U.S. arrive in South Carolina to begin a project that will come to be known as the Port Royal Experiment. They are joined by the famed Harriet Tubman, who brought many people to freedom with the Underground Railroad. She nursed the Civil War injured, while she showed the newly freed people how to willingly work in a wage-based system, rather than being forced to labor under the threat of the lash. Miss Laura Town established the Penn School on St. Helena Island, just a ferry ride across the Sound from Fort Frederick, an institution that is still in operation today. Lincoln watched the experiment with great interest, and during the summer of 1862 announced the preliminary Emancipation Proclamation. Immediately, plans were made for an elaborate celebration at Camp Saxton for January 1, 1863, the day the proclamation was to be signed.
And it's very elaborate. They are roasting 10 oxen and preparing tables for 4,000 or 5,000 people to come down to it.
Of course, when it was read and after it was read, someone spontaneously popped out with the song, "My Country 'Tis of Thee," and jubilation took place. But the Emancipation Proclamation was a high point in their lives at that time.
When the Emancipation Proclamation was read, they used that fort as the base for their dock. You know, and the dock was built over the top of the fort, and boats came in. But there it was, I mean, at ground zero of that event. And that event is as significant event as ever occurred in 500 years of history of this county, certainly, and one of the most important events in the state's history.
A devastating hurricane shook the Sea Islands in 1893, causing massive damage. More than 2,000 people died. Yet the sturdiness of the 5-foot-tall and 5-foot-wide walls saved the fort from annihilation. Today, it still stands as the oldest tabby structure in South Carolina. In the winter of 2015, archaeologists worked to excavate the remains of Fort Frederick in preparation for the day when it will be accessible to the public by land for the first time in many years. Old Fort Frederick is also being given a new layer of tabby in preparation for its future as the one remaining ambassador to witness a pivotal historical event. The fort's most important job, as it turned out, was to serve as the actual bridge from the waters of Port Royal Sound, supporting people as they stepped toward their celebration of freedom.
that's what's happening in Beaufort County. Here's what's happening in Beaufort County.
So basically this is a chance for the citizens of Beaufort, people that live in Beaufort and people that work and play in Beaufort, to come and meet all of the entities that will be providing services for them in the event of another storm. So you have every agency out here that would be involved in such an event, and people can actually ask them questions directly face to face and get the good information from the horse's mouth. The emergency management is a partnership. It's every agency at every level. So you have state agencies, you have local agencies for the city of Beaufort, you have the county. We all plug into one architecture and we all work together. And that's really the only way you can effectively work in emergency management, is to do a team effort. So everybody in the team is here and we're all on the same page.
We are here promoting animal safety, preparedness for hurricane disaster situations. We have a lot of great information that people should obtain just to know where to go in case of hurricane. And a lot of people tend to leave their animals behind. We have to do a lot of rescue. It ties up a lot of our time. So knowing and being
with nothing to report, and this meeting stands adjourned. Thank you all.
Good.